here. Welcome to Tuesday Teaching Tips, episode 165. And today we're talking about why you need Keynote Stories. As part of your preaching and teaching arsenal, you need Keynote Stories. You say, well, I understand about illustrations. Yes, but what about Keynote Stories? What are they and why are they so important? I used a keynote illustration about an epileptic, my encounter with an epileptic recently. I posted about the unusual reaction I got to that I wasn't expecting in last week's Tuesday Teaching Tips. You might like to go back and watch that. But the unusual reaction aside, it was a keynote illustration. And I'd like to talk about the significance of having a body of keynote illustrations handy, ready at hand for the right occasion, why they're important, and how to prepare them for use in any talk that you give. So first of all, let's make sure we got our definitions right. What is a keynote story? I'd say they share 4 characteristics and then 2 extra things I'd like to mention. The first is this. A keynote story is generally a story that has an emotional connection for you. So that when I tell a keynote story, I have an emotional connection with that story. Usually it's a story about me. It doesn't have to be. Often it is. But I must have an emotional connection with it. Secondly, it's a story that you can tell without notes. You don't need notes. You don't need bullet points. This is a story it's deep within you. It's almost part of you. It's part of your life. It's part of your experiences. It's a story you know really well. That's the second thing. The third thing is it contains some kind of punchline. There's a high point or even a low point to the story that makes people stop. And that's the fourth thing, which is it's a story that generally causes a laugh or a gasp in your audience, or quite possibly both, a laugh and or a gasp. So in this way, those 4 points show us that keynote stories are really parables. When we think about the parables that Jesus used, they had that kind of emotional connection. They had that moment of a laugh or a gasp. They were clearly stories that people remembered and you didn't need notes for. They had some kind of punchline. So they're like a parable. And the last thing I'd say about defining them is keynote stories are not anecdotes. Anecdotes are very handy, very useful. They don't contain, though, a narrative arc. A story, a keynote story in particular, has a narrative arc, which we'll talk more about in a minute. An anecdote tells us, it makes a point, but doesn't take you on a journey. Keynote stories have a kind of a shape. So what does a typical keynote story look like? I would say it answers 3 questions and then gives you an opportunity. So a typical keynote story answers 3 questions. The first is, where do you start? What's the starting point? What's the starting location? Maybe geographically, but it could also be emotionally. It could be to do with a stage of life. Where do you start? It has a beginning, and then it has somewhere where the story takes you, usually through a challenge or a bad place, some kind of tough experience. So you have a start, you have a bad or tough experience, it takes you on that journey through somewhere, and then you end up somewhere. So where did you end up? So it answers 3 questions. Where did you start? Where did the story take you? And where did you end up? Those are the 3 questions that it answers. And the opportunity it gives you is that when you've told your story, there's a fairly obvious point you can make. There's something that you can say to your congregation as a result of having heard that and say, you know what, this shows us that, or illustrates that, or the question I have for us all is, and when people hear it, they will be able to connect what the story you've just told with the point you're making. So you get the opportunity to make the point, a powerful point that your talk needs. Third thing, where do we keep our keynote stories? We need to keep them somewhere. You may say my memory is enough, but you will forget even those keynote stories, especially if you're trying to think under pressure. in preparation for a lesson, and you're just not able to recall those stories. So where do you keep them? I keep mine in a folder in Evernote, a software program that I use for a lot of illustrations and files. You can keep audio files in there, you can keep pictures, articles, all kinds of things you can keep in there. So I have a folder called Keynote Illustrations, and then I tag them so that I can find them. So I might tag them with spiritual themes or theological themes like baptism or conviction or sin, and so I can look through my keynote stories in different ways and find them. You can keep yours anywhere, but keep them separate, I would say, from your other illustrations. You may say, well, all illustrations are illustrations. Yes, but it's helpful to have even a subfolder of your keynote illustrations, because again, you may think you may remember them all, but you won't. Sometimes I'm surprised when I go back to the folder and look at all my keynote illustrations. Oh yes, I'd forgotten about that. I have in there a story about the epileptic I used recently. I have a story about riding a motorbike for the first time in India as a pillion passenger, which was quite scary, and I'll tell you that another time. I have a keynote story in there about my university dissertation and the trauma and the triumph involved there. I have a story in there about praying in a car with a friend of mine called Mark Wells and things that happened. I have a story about the first time when I was very young, when I told the first girl ever that I loved her and what happened there. I have a more sober story about the death of my brother when I was only 10 years old or so, and a lot more. But I know they're there, and anytime, not every lesson needs a keynote story, but whenever I feel the need for a keynote story, I go back to that folder and ask myself and pray, God, will any of these help the people I'm going to be speaking to? So keep them somewhere specific. That's all I would say. How do we best use a keynote story? It's all fine to have them, but how do we best use them? Let me give you 4 things to think about here. First of all, use them one at a time. In other words, one per lesson. If these are keynote stories, they are significantly emotionally charged. If you use more than one in a lesson, you will overwhelm your audience and you'll probably confuse them because they won't know which of these 2 main illustrations and points to pay attention to. So use just the one. They pack an emotional punch. Secondly, edit them. Most keynote stories can be told in 1 minute or 10 minutes because they usually are very significant parts of our own lives and contain some very dramatic events. So there's lots of extraneous detail and context, and you have to decide each time you use the story which details to keep and which to leave out on this occasion. When I used the story about the epileptic recently, I mentioned that I was at university, but I didn't mention that I was studying music. I mentioned that I was at university. I don't think I mentioned that it was Birmingham. Those things don't matter. Now, if I was telling the story in Birmingham to the church there, I would mention that I was a student at Birmingham University. If I was with a bunch of musicians, I would mention that I was studying music at the time, but it wasn't relevant on that particular Sunday. So be ruthless and edit out any details of the story, as interesting as you may find them and as meaningful as you may find them. If they're not meaningful to the people you're speaking to, cut them out. So use one and edit them. Thirdly, tell the story slowly. By slowly, I don't mean drag your words, but I mean tell the story slower than you would tell it to yourself or to someone, just one person that you were with. When you're telling a powerful emotional story to a group, you've got to give them time to absorb the story and the emotional impact. And that means telling the story more slowly than you feel comfortable speaking. Take it a little slower, perhaps slower than the rest of your lesson. The story has emotional content. It needs to be absorbed, or when you get to my 4th point, which is about the punchline, you won't get the reaction and it won't have an impact in the way that it could. So give your audience time to take in the story by telling the story slowly. And then fourthly, I've preempted this, but the 4th thing is there must be a punchline. There are always punchlines in these keynote illustrations. So practice that high point. You're reaching that high point, or it could even be a low point in the story. Practice that point as you get there beforehand. Practice it thinking about this particular audience. Practice that punchline. So those are 4 things. The best way to use a keynote story is firstly, use 1 per lesson. Secondly, edit your story. Thirdly, tell it slowly. And fourthly, make sure you've practiced that punchline and it comes at the right point. Why are keynote illustrations so important? Let me give you 2 reasons that come to my mind. Firstly, authenticity. A keynote story by definition is one that is meaningful to you. When we tell stories that are meaningful to us, I mean, you've probably seen, you may have done this yourself, I know I have, where I've told a story or I've used an illustration that I just didn't really personally connect with very much. It's not a bad story, it's not a bad illustration, but I didn't connect with it. And when I told it, it lacked authenticity. But when I tell a keynote story, keynote illustration, it's meaningful to me, and so it comes across with the authenticity that is actually there. It has authenticity. I should never, of course, try to be authentic, but I don't even have to try. It's authentic because it's significant to me. So that's why telling these stories really matters. They're often about incidents that have had a significant impact on the way that we view the world, ourselves, or God. So that's the first thing, authenticity. The second thing is that they're memorable. These stories are memorable, and that helps the people we're speaking to. You remember these stories, and so will your audience if you use them well. Hopefully, your audience will continue to attach the particular spiritual point you were making through the illustration to that illustration long after they've left the auditorium, they've left the building. Even days later, they'll still be thinking about that story, and that will remind them of the point, and that will help them carry through the week and through their lives that significant spiritual point that you know God wanted to communicate to them. 2 reasons why keynote illustrations are so significant. They convey a spiritual point with authenticity, and they convey a spiritual point memorably. And that's a great help to the people that we are speaking to. Now, I have recorded previously on the difference between anecdotes and stories. So if you want to look that up, I'm putting the links in the show notes to an episode I did called What's the Difference Between an Anecdote and a Story, and another one called Anecdotes versus Stories. So those links will be in the show notes. You can look those up if you want a bit more detail on anecdotes and stories, although I think I've covered most of it here. I would like to know what you think. What do you think about the significance of keynote stories and illustrations and the best way to use them? What are some of the things that you do to make sure that they have an impact but aren't overwhelming? I would really like to know what you've done. So please drop a comment into the comment box, whether you're listening to the podcast or watching the video. Let us all know what you think. Leave these comments publicly so that we can learn from each other, because we learn best in community. If you could think of anybody who might benefit from this recording, please pass the link on. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already done so. Hit the notification bell. Give us a thumbs up, maybe. I'd appreciate that. If you're listening to the podcast, please leave a review in Apple Podcasts. That helps the visibility of these recordings, and we can spread the word more widely. And I just want to thank you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and thank you for taking part with me in what is something that really matters as to how we communicate God's word. That's why I put the teaching tips together, 165 of them now. That's why I have a YouTube playlist of teaching tips, which you can go and have a look at. That's why I put these on my website, by the way. If you're not subscribed yet, please go to the website and subscribe. You'll get my weekly newsletter, and you'll get all the goodies there. And I'll even send you a free ebook called How God Helps His People Grow. Thanks again. I hope you have a wonderful week and a terrific Tuesday. Take care and God bless.